The following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. A lot of things to discuss today, including the latest visit to Tucson of J.D. Vance and Active Management Area coming to southern Arizona. But first, let me introduce our distinguished panel. Christopher Conover of AZPM, Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel, Katya Mendoza, also of AZPM, and Caitlyn Schmidt of the Tucson Spotlight. Thank you all for being here today. Caitlyn, last week we discussed extensively the latest goings-on with Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos. He's dragging a local publication into all sorts of investigations. But let's have the latest from this week, which I found most interesting, which is that one of the two people who is suing Sheriff Nanos, one of the people he suspended, is now suing him. Can we get into a little bit of the lawsuit, what it says?
Yes, definitely. So he is being sued by a sergeant who is also the leader of one of the unions. It's a federal lawsuit for violating his civil rights. He suspended this officer for allegedly campaigning off duty in what appeared to be a uniform. And the lawsuit is calling that a bunch of baloney.
Yeah, Dylan, let's get into a little bit about Heather Lappin, too, the other person who was suspended very prominently because this is actually Nanos' opponent in the general election. At this point, she is still claiming that she is, because she's under a gag order, really can't even campaign. Nanos came out and said that wasn't entirely true.
Sort of, and not really. There's kind of an open question. Just exactly what Sheriff Nanos told Lieutenant Heather Lappin, who is one of the commanders at the Pima County Jail, campaigning against him. She is talking a little bit about the situation she's in, but not very much. And she says, and her lawyer says that she's under a gag order, that the sheriff put her under, saying you can't talk about this investigation. What he is calling an investigation. He says he has an internal investigation going and claims that he asked the Arizona Attorney General's office and the FBI to investigate as well.
Mr. Conover, you have something?
I do. I want to jump on. We actually got an email from the Attorney General's office last night. Hannah Cree, who's our lead reporter on this, they're not investigating based on that email. The FBI has been a bit more close-lipped about that, but it's interesting, and all of this is coming, of course, when Supervisor Matt Hines has now wants to put forward a censure of Nanos, which, let's face it, is an official slap on the wrist. That's about all it's worth. But then Nanos had a 4-page, single-spaced response to that. Suffice to say, he was not particularly happy with that idea.
I want to get to the supervisor point in a moment, but Caitlyn, let me come back to this. What changed in 2023? There was a law that Nanos is citing saying that, Lappin wouldn't have been allowed to run against me in the first place. How significant is that law in this current campaign?
It was pretty significant until now that she's back on leave again. Previously, there was a law that if you were running for county office and you worked for the county, you had to be placed on administrative leave, which we saw play out in 2016 and 2020. In 2016, Nanos actually suspended a political rival, put him on administrative leave days after he announced that he was running. And he wasn't in a position to do so in 2020, but we did have some very damning news about one of his opponents come out days before the election last time around as well. So this is a little bit of history repeating itself.
A pattern?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a pattern going on here, and certainly we've seen this play out, the most with the Pima County Sheriff's Department and races for sheriff. There have been, some conflicts with people who have been staff running against their bosses in other elected county offices over the years as well.
Yeah. Katya, what stands out to you about what's going on with the situation? Because to a lot of us, it just seems so bizarre. I'm someone who spends most of my time in Phoenix. I thought, wait a second, this is actually happening during a campaign. What stands out for you?
I guess it'll be really interesting to see what happens on election day. I'm not super familiar with what had happened in the past, him doing the same thing to a former political rival. So that really is interesting to see.
Yeah, that's Chris. I think it's one of those things. You have the Democrat. Nanos is the Democrat in a county like this. That should give him a huge advantage. But also reported on AZPM, at least as far as individual contributions go, Heather Lappin is outraising Chris Nanos.
Not only is she outraising him, and again, I have to give props to Hannah Krieg because this is her race, whether she wants it or not. She's our lead reporter on it. And she looked at the campaign finances. Not only is Lappin out raising Nanos, most of Nanos' money has come from himself. He is basically largely self-funding this campaign.
I'm really struck. This is an incumbent who is, that's where, so has he had trouble fundraising in the past?
Not that I recall.
Not to this extent. And something that I think is significant as well is the fact that so many prominent Democrats have come out and endorsed Heather Lappin, the Republican, running against the incumbent Democrat. You know, you have City Councilman Paul Cunningham has publicly endorsed Matt Hines, certainly the supervisor who is asking for Nanos to be censured, and
Dr. Richard Carmona,
a whole lot of other top of the line Democrats in Pima County and in Tucson have very, I think, significantly not made any endorsement at all. Mm-hmm. If you go down the list of the people that they say, vote for these folks, the sheriff is not on there.
Caitlyn, the timing of this is especially interesting because one would think, okay, we're just a couple of weeks ahead of time here, but a lot of Arizonans do early mail-in balloting. So how big a chance is Nanos taking? I would think as someone who's running for elected office again, he's thinking about this politically. But politically, this seems like a really unwise move unless he thinks, well, early ballots went out a couple weeks ago, won't hurt me too much.
I suspect that's where he's thinking with this. I have talked to a number of people that have already returned their ballots. I don't think most people are like me who fills theirs out early and then forgets to turn it in until the day of. But we do know that historically Republicans do tend to vote at the polls. So this isn't really impacting his base, it seems. And he has certainly had bad news following him in the past, and it didn't impact the election. So, I mean, that party name might be enough to carry him through again.
Yeah, Chris, how much did he win by last time? Not to put you on the spot, but...
I don't remember. Dylan, do you remember? He beat Republican Mark Napier, who had beaten him 4 years previously after he had been appointed to fill out the rest of the term of longtime Pima County Sheriff
Mr.
Clarence
Dupnik.
I don't remember, to be perfectly honest,
Okay.
4 years ago.
Because I'm just wondering how close it was and whether this bodes poorly for him in some way, that maybe it was a narrow victory.
I think Caitlyn's right on. I think this will move the needle, but because of early voting, and it's a down ballot race, I think especially people who are prone to just vote party, or when they get to those down ballot races say, oh, I don't know, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and they'll just start voting party. So much more attention has been paid on the Senate, a little bit on CD6 House, obviously President, and some of the propositions that by the time they get to sheriff, it's a little more just wrote down the ballot.
That's an interesting point, Katya. The fact that it's an enormous ballot, and we've talked about this before, the idea that President, Senate, some of the propositions. I mean, is that a possibility that the people just will not even pay as much attention? We're obsessed with it. We think it's a very important story because it is, but maybe the average voter doesn't?
I think I would disagree with that. I think especially with this election, the emphasis from everyone that's been coming to Tucson as of late is stressing the fact that it is a down the ballot sort of election.
So what happens if somehow Nanos loses? How could that potentially affect the politics of Pima County?
Well, I mean, looking back just 4 years ago, we had a Republican sheriff who was essentially a fairly centrist Republican. You know, he did make a lot of visits to the White House, Donald Trump's White House, because he was a Republican in a fairly prominent position here on the border. But, his management of the agency and the recommendations he made to, the Democratic Board of Supervisors basically aligned. He wasn't, a sort of constitutional sheriff.
Right.
Like we have, seen, very right-wing Republican sheriffs. And, Lappin has not really aligned herself with the far right throughout this campaign.
When Napier was sheriff, the only real conflict I remember, and I wasn't covering the Board of Supervisors heavily, maybe one of the two of you will remember, was over Operation Stone Garden funding, which is federal funding to help with border enforcement, and that went away. But that was really the only conflict that I remember between the Republican sheriff and the largely Democratic Pima County Board of Supervisors.
And Napier's stance on border issues was in many ways fairly aligned with what the Democrats on the Board of Supervisors were saying. You know, he was not in favor of Trump building a border wall and things like that. He called it a medieval solution. We haven't seen Lappin, that directly challenge a whole lot of, Trump sloganeering. But, the tenor of her campaign and in her primary, she beat, two folks in the Republican primary who were much more to the right than she is.
Yeah. Caitlyn, let's close it out with a little bit more about the supervisors that Chris mentioned. So it is a Democratic majority, and yet Matt Hines' case obviously coming out very strongly. And the supervisors seem pretty unhappy with the fact that Sheriff Nanos did not want to come speak to them about sexual assault investigation until after the election. How does all of this bode for the relationship that they are going to have going forward, at least till the end of this year?
I mean, I think the relationship between supervisors and Sheriff Nanos is already pretty fractured. We had an incident previously where they wanted to discuss something with him about that sexual assault investigation. He pulled deputies out of the meetings and then put them back, but it was certainly a shots fired situation. So I think it's already pretty strained.
So in his 4-page response, he said, "I will talk with you about this anytime." As you've said, there have been a couple of times, most recently 2 weeks ago, where he was, shall we say, invited and did not show up.
Dramatic exaggeration, but he seems to be almost entering the realm of the attention that someone that I don't live too far away from, Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, used to get, almost like headlines all the time, and not necessarily positive for him or his office. So interesting to keep watching that. Okay, so vice presidential nominee on the GOP side, Dylan, J.D. Vance has returned. I know you were excited that he came back. What was the significance of this visit? It seemed like he talked about the exact same things, border security, mass deportation, things like that. So why does he keep coming back?
Well, J.D. Vance came back yet again. We're just seeing a constant parade of, national political figures of various prominence, I would guess, some pretty high level and a whole lot of middling folks trying to turn out the vote. Both Democrats, especially here in Southern Arizona, and Republicans are trying to encourage every last person they can to vote. So basically daily we are getting emails and invites to events with, some of them are political figures from 30 years ago who are kind of showing up, and some of them are a little bit more prominent, like J.D. Vance. And I'm, how many more days do we have till the election? We're going to see, another 25, 30 people come through Southern Arizona over the next week or so.
And some of them aren't even that well, for lack of a better term, advertised. For example, Beto O'Rourke was on the UA campus this week. Last week it was Tulsi Gabbard. And they almost don't care if we show up. They're really here going after the student vote. So,
right.
Yeah.
Katya, what do you think about the message that J.D. Vance is bringing, especially to Southern Arizona, not far from the border? But he really continues to hit what a lot of people would call incredibly negative things when it comes to mass deportation of immigrants. There hasn't been a lot of discussion even of the Dreamers by either Democrats or Republicans who come to visit. What do you make of his visiting and what he's talking about?
I think that his message isn't necessarily changing. I think, it stays the same. He knows the people that he is targeting and speaking to, so he really doesn't have to change his tune. I think he's just coming to see his fans, sort of thing. But
does it feel like the audiences are getting smaller, bigger, less, or more excited?
I would say smaller in the main. People who, even if you're very politically engaged, you're not going to go to every single one of these. You just don't have time, and there are too many, and you get worn out with it. We may see a couple more prominent folks come to town in the next week or
they
so.
Better hurry.
Yeah. And, people may show up for that, especially, in the last 4 days right before the election.
Yeah.
Well, and I think when former President Obama came to town, a lot of people went just to see former President Obama. Yeah. They knew what his message was going to be. No one was surprised that he did not endorse Donald Trump in that rally. So they knew the message, but they want to see.
But that's a dynamic
Obama.
experience. He's a heck of a speaker, and people want to go, listen to him and see him in person. Some of these other folks, I won't name names, but
we know you want to. Yeah.
Who cares?
But the President Obama visit, what struck me a little bit is that here's a surrogate who potentially could outshine the ticket. And I wonder if sometimes that's a danger. Like maybe Bill Clinton would have been 10 years ago, not anymore, but at that time. So is that a danger in any way, or is that just, no, here's a great person to pump up the people?
I think it was a great person to pump up the people. You know, we had a special unannounced guest with Gabby Giffords who really pumped up people. I mean, that was very much a hometown visit for Tucsonans to, you know, remember maybe the worst time in our recent history and how we came together then and pump people up to come together now and vote.
Yeah, let's spend a couple brief minutes on Senator Mark Kelly traveling across the state in support of Harrison Walls. How popular is Mark Kelly? I think of Mark Kelly to be incredibly popular. You mentioned Gabby Giffords, Tucson. This is a great person, I presume, for the Harris Walls to campaign to be talking about them.
Oh, I think...
Could there be anybody better locally? I mean,
you know, I don't know that that's hard to say because Mark doesn't, or let me rephrase, there is no Mark without Gabby. I think she's such a national treasure, really a beloved person here. Her story has been so inspiring to not only Tucsonans, but I think her impact has been felt nationally.
Yeah, ultimate power couple, really.
Yeah.
At least for Arizona at this point. No one is knocking them off that pedestal. You know, and Mark gets to, because he was apparently flying his own plane. Well, it wasn't his plane. We checked that. It was a consulting firm's plane. But, you know, he was flying it around. Again, it's that subtle reminder. I was a combat pilot. I was an astronaut. You know, those little subtle reminders as he kind of almost barnstormed around the state for a couple of days. And he was going to places not Tucson, not Metro Phoenix. Right. He was going to smaller rural places, showing them some love.
Mm-hmm. Significance of Mark Kelly, what do you think, Bill?
You know, this would have been an amazing political stunt if we weren't in this kind of political, you know, situation that we're in this election with so much going on and so many people. Like, kind of this almost just fell into the noise, right?
It did.
Yeah.
I think it caught the attention of young voters. I have a very young staff at Spotlight, and they thought it was very cool to have a candidate who could fly his own plane to his own events, which I also agree is pretty cool. And I'm not a young voter, so, you know, it's a specialty.
Well, I remember when Martha McSally and Dylan, I remember you being there, and I think, Caitlyn, you were there in the hangar out at Tucson International when she declared that she was running for Senate. Then she got in an old, like, World War II era plane and flew out, you know, kind of that same subtle reminder, combat pilot and everything that came with.
But she didn't take her dog with her. If she would have taken the dog,
if she'd taken Boomer,
that would have sold the whole election right there.
Yeah, Boomer could have been always the key to that.
Okay, Chris and Katya, I'm going to turn to you guys on this one because of some great reporting by AZPM. Arizona Department of Water Resources, with the support of Governor Hobbs, is looking to create an active management area in the Willcox area related to groundwater protection. Let's just do a quick, what is an active management area, first of all?
An active management area, basically what is going on in Willcox right now is if you own the land, sink a straw, and there you go. With the active management area, it's not that easy. You have to get permits and things like that, and the permits are based on how much water you have pumped historically, which is going to cause a problem in the Willcox area based on some of our reporting and talking with some of the smaller farmers down there, because some of the bigger farms are being accused of literally just pumping water out so they can run the meters up, basically. We'll see how this works out. But we also have to remember 2 years ago, a Willcox Active Management Area was on the ballot and was defeated pretty strongly. The one in Douglas went up. But having been down in Willcox recently with Governor Hobbs, people down there were starting to rethink that and say, maybe they all agreed something needed to be done. They weren't fully on board with the active management area, but they were moving much closer to it.
Katya, whether it's successful or not, we don't know will be. How significant is that, considering as of a few weeks ago, and because of AZPM reporting, it seems like it really moved forward on this. How much of a difference could that make in that area in a state that is so concerned about drought?
I think, you know, it might be able to, I don't know if setting precedent is a good way to describe that. What I found really interesting is that Buzz went down there with Governor Hobbs and was able to listen to her listening to, you know, these concerned residents in the Willcox area. And what really stood out to me, this one woman, she said, you know, what can you do for us? She was asking the governor, what can you do for us? And Governor Hobbs, you know, wasn't making a promise right then and there of being able to do anything. So then, a couple months later, or how
about a month.
Yeah, she directs the ADWR to start the process of considering an active management area. So who knows?
Well, and one of the things I think a lot of people forget about when we talk about water in Arizona, we always talk about the Colorado River. Willcox is not getting Colorado River water. They're not getting CAP water. And the headline of the story we wrote from that trip down there was a quote from somebody who had really pushed Governor Hobbs. And she said, this aquifer is our Colorado River. And it kind of really focuses the issue for a lot of people when you think about it that way.
Dylan, I want to close this out with a political angle on this, which is because some criticism has come from the Republican side of the aisle, and that's in part because active management areas, to some, are at least considered controversial. Do you think because water is so important, these Republicans might get on board, or no?
Well, I think it kind of depends on which Republicans you're talking about. If you're talking about, folks who are local to an area who realize that this is about local control of a resource, they may end up backing it. One thing I've noticed about this issue as it's been playing out over the past few months is Hobbs is not directly taking credit for any of these moves. She has been thanking the Department of Water Resources for doing things. These folks work for her. They do what she says to do. But she's not saying, hey, I did this. She's saying, oh, thanks for the water department for handling this.
Chris,
so she's kind of keeping a little bit of remove as to, waiting to see just what happens politically.
Yeah, does that ring true for you?
It does, because when Hobbs was down there, as Katya correctly points out, the people she was meeting with were very direct. What can you do for us? And she kept saying, we'll find something. But she also kept saying a month ago, we're going to put this on the legislature. The legislature needs to do something. There are things we can do with executive powers, but we would need the legislature to do it. And when we pressed her, so what's your timetable on that? The legislature. Now, a month later, she's directed ADWR to start the process of constructing an active management area. I'll point out that that comes a few weeks after the Attorney General, Chris Mays, sent a nasty finger-wagging letter to ADWR about some of the things that they had done out in La Paz County, allowing some wells to be sunk by Fondamonte, the Saudi company. So all of this is kind of, I think, playing together where the Attorney General is saying, oh, you can do something right now, you have the power.
Yeah.
So I think there's a little bit of a dynamic, even though Hobbs and Mays are both Democrats, I think there's a little dynamic there too.
Okay. Caitlyn, our last few minutes, I want to have everybody weigh in on this because most of us who drive are affected by parking. And yet if one sort of looks 30,000 feet, why is there a fight about extending Tucson parking meters and having, so what's at the core of this?
I mean, the core is there's not enough parking ever. But I think what we're hearing right after this has come out about extending metered parking 3 hours later in the weeks and then all day Saturday, 8 to 8, is that this is really going to harm workers in those areas who use those meters and business owners and potentially businesses themselves. I mean, nobody wants to pay more for anything. Parking is a premium, and I think I enjoy free Saturday parking when I'm lucky enough to find it. So who knows the impact of that in some very popular tourist and local destinations.
Yeah, Katya, the worker point is an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having to drive down to your place of work, finding parking downtown, like I'm thinking 4th Avenue is just very stressful. I can only imagine, but then having to pay. And then I did see an article, I think it might have been from the Sentinel. This woman was saying, having to keep an eye and like go back and feed the meter, during your shift, that kind of sucks. So
when you're not supposed to feed the meter anyway.
All right.
There are a whole lot of interlocking issues.
Okay.
Parking meters are not to raise money. They don't really raise all that money. They're to ensure that there are places to park for customers, that people do not park in those places and stay there for their entire shift. It's to have turnover in parking so that when people come to, patronize a restaurant or something like that, to shop downtown, that they can find a place. That's the justification for having parking meters in the first place. But when you look at how all of the various, agencies that are responsible for parking downtown work together, like, moving to Saturdays, moving to, having meters later at night. Some of those parking garages close pretty early. Okay. And, you can't park in them if you're working down there in those times. So, that's where the controversy arises. Not so much, what exists right now during the day, especially on weekdays, but the nights and introducing Saturdays, they're going to have to not just change parking meters, but change garage times and make up a bunch of other adjustments for this to not really cause a hassle for folks.
So that's another step that is expected then, or no?
I don't know what's expected, but just plain if you take the downtown area of Tucson where the Rialto is and Hotel Congress is, if they both have shows, that parking garage right there starts to fill up. There's not a lot of street parking right there anyway. All of a sudden, as Dylan said, now you're starting to run out of parking. Oh, what about the entire staff of Hotel Congress or the Rialto or whatever? There's a lot.
Okay, and how much is it going to cost more, briefly?
Oh, of course. Okay. It always costs more.
Okay, that wraps up this edition of The Press Room. From AZPM, our guests, Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel, Caitlyn Schmidt of Tucson Spotlight, and Katya Mendoza and Christopher Conover, both of AZPM. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for joining us as well. I'm Steve Goldstein.